Welcome to the third live talk show of GlocomNet, Portal of Global Complexity Network. My name is Connie Dorrestein and I'm your host today. This broadcast is part of a series of 6 monthly programs around the theme of complexity. These programs, and thus this broadcast, are interactive, which means you can join us by active participation. By sending an email to info@glocomnet.com, you can reach the editor immediately, who will then try to get your question on the table. We remind you in advance that the number of sign-in viewers suggests that many questions are to be expected, and it may be that your response is not addressed. In that case, we will try to reach you in a different way after the broadcast with a response. Today, we're talking about scenario thinking, and joining me are Professor Lex Hoogduin, University of Groningen on my left for the viewer to the right side. Further, Rick Berbé, a change facilitator and co-founder of GlocomNet. And finally, Yvonne Seym, welcome, Director at Sanders Treasury and Finance, and as such, a practitioner in scenario thinking in the financial services industry. And for all clarity, we have agreed to address each other by first name. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. In 2014, Timothy Geithner wrote a book called Stress Test. His view on the credit crisis, which he observed very up close as head of the New York Federal Reserve, and in the aftermath during his tenure as Secretary of the Treasury. That surely was a complex and uncertain period that reached far and deep beyond the financial services industry. To solve a major financial crisis, he writes, you have to do things you would never do in normal times, or even in a modest crisis. He also observes that the one thing that really lacked back then was imagination. Even though the signs were there, we simply could not imagine it would be so bad. Scenario thinking is all about that. The art of imagination for better and for worse. Welcome. Lex, first going to you. Timothy Geithner up close during the crisis. So were you at that time during the Euro crisis. Can you tell me what you experienced in that period and what you, with hindsight, would or could suggest to do differently?
Yeah, let me go back to that period and start a little bit earlier. And let me first say that if you think about complexity and uncertainty, you have to make a move from trying to forecast to trying to imagine things like Timothy Geithner said. And if we go back to the crisis, in the run-up to the crisis, there were many pension funds in the Netherlands. We have a fully funded pension system and several hundreds of pension funds. And some of them very, very big and well-known internationally. Yeah. Many of those pension funds were used to think in terms of trying to forecast. And for a pension fund, there's one single variable that's very important: what will happen to the interest rate? And they always asked you, what are interest rates gonna do? Yeah. And they were very confused because interest rates were already years before the crisis, were all the time were declining. Yeah. We're on a declining path, and many pension funds and investors in pension funds couldn't believe that this would continue, and they tried to find grounds for forecast that interest rates would recover and would go up, and they literally couldn't imagine that interest rates would continue to go down. And that intensified that process during the crisis. Central banks started to reduce interest rates, and interest rates declined even further and went to close to zero, and in some cases even negative. And still, not all, but there were still pension funds that still try to maintain their forecasting mode. So what could pension funds have done better already before the crisis? Not thinking in terms of what will probably happen, but in terms of what might happen. In terms of what is the possible, what are the possible outcomes. Yeah. And then you enter scenario thinking, and that's what you have to do in a complex and uncertain world, because in a complex and uncertain world you cannot predict. That's almost a definition of what complexity and uncertainty is. So what they could have done is to simply think in terms of two potential scenarios. One scenario in which interest rates would remain low for quite some time and could even potentially fall further, and another in which that was not the case. If they would have done that, they very likely would have followed in some cases, radically different approach to their investment portfolio.
Yeah.
So many pension funds, as I said earlier, almost hoped that that interest rates would go up, and in that context, they were not inclined, let's say, to hedge their portfolios against further falls in interest rates, because they thought they were certain enough that interest rates would go up. If they would have thought in terms of that it could be possible that the interest rate would remain low, then they possibly would have hedged their portfolio more strongly than they did.
Yes.
And that's not just a thing that with hindsight we could say, well, it's not just a technical thing.
Yeah.
It would have meant that several pension funds that are now forced to cut the pensions or not compensate for inflation would have been in a position to continue to link the pensions to inflation rates. And also at the moment, it's again the season by the end of the year, and you see that this is a deeply ingrained habit in the financial sector. You now see again several banks and investment houses and asset managers publish what they call their outlook for next year, and these are forecasts. And what they should do is to move to scenario thinking. That could, if you do so, it seems small, but it can have a big impact.
So it's wishful thinking is a huge ingredient in this case.
Yeah.
And so the outlook of the pension funds, we should read them with the same sentiment as my horoscope for next year.
Yeah, perhaps so. Yes.
Yes, perhaps so. Okay, let's then try and frame a little bit of thinking around the theme of the thinking in, I've lost the word, scenarios. Yes. Sorry for that. Yeah. There's many ways in which you can use scenarios. There are many types of scenarios. So what I suggest, with your approval, we're going to go through 3 of those, get some context, and then hopefully you as practitioners can give us some relevant real-life samples, because I think that's what the viewers would really like. So if we start with one very well-known scenario is the scenario where you look for realistic roadmaps for strategy legs. How can you imagine possible futures and align it with your corporate strategy and structure?
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that one before we jump into some examples? Yeah,
so that's indeed the first type of scenarios. Then you use scenarios indeed to determine what is usually called your strategy or your course of action. And then you realize that you cannot just extrapolate what happened in the past or use a model of the past and extrapolate that, and that then determines which way you want to go. No, what you try to do then is to indeed, like I explained for the pension funds, think about possible futures and what could determine the future, and then on the basis of that you could think about where do I want to go myself, and how can I, what kind of actions can I take to move in the direction that I've imagined.
That you strategically would like to go.
So that's and that type of scenario is the scenario of the possible that you can use basically for two purposes. The first one is indeed for setting out a course of action, determining your strategy, but it's also very useful for using it as part of your what we call in our own way of dealing with uncertainty, of being alert. Because we know that a scenario is not a forecast, and you should be aware always that it's very unlikely that the future will unfold exactly in the way that you have imagined it. Yeah. So you don't imagine it because you have the pretense of exactly following that path, but it is used as a kind of a compass, a guidance, and also helping you. It's as were a set of glasses that you put on. It helps you to be alert, to be always be on guard that the future will always hold surprises, positive ones and negative ones, and you have to detect surprises. And one way of helping you to detect surprises is to think about what are the key drivers in your scenarios. For instance, if you a couple of years ago had thought about the euro crisis, in my view at that time, there was only one very important driver of what could develop, and that was whether we would end up with further integration in the euro area as a response to the crisis, or we would end up with disintegration. So in terms of, so then you have two scenarios, two possible outcomes, none of them likely to be the outcome itself, but it helps you if then all kinds of new information comes in, how to look at the information, not just to look at everything, but it helps you to select and filter the information. You look at it, in this case, through the lens of, is new information suggesting that we are moving in the direction of integration, or is it disintegration? So scenario thinking in this line, thinking about the possible, helps you to set out your strategy, and it helps you to
build in alerts.
To be alert and to travel through time.
So, Rick, Yvonne, where have you seen this live in action? Do you see boards that actively deploy this as a management tool and build in alerts at mid-management level even?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, as a practitioner in the financial sector, I see that in the banking industry and insurance industry, scenario thinking is, well, widely used for various purposes. I think it's traditionally mainly used in the risk management area, but it's more and more used also in the corporate planning, in the business cycle, to evaluate the impact of possible developments or changes in economic parameters. And as part of the business planning and the budgeting cycles, we see more and more that multiple scenarios are developed and applied and evaluated to also take into account in the strategic decision making. So I see that scenario thinking is evolving from more the stress side and as a risk management tool to really a management tool, which I think is a good development.
Yeah. The interesting thing is Yvonne is absolutely right that nowadays it's applied very frequently in the financial sector. I think it's fair to say that the original of scenario thinking is based in the energy sector. Shell has become famous for thinking in terms of scenarios, and that's the type of industries where you have very long horizons, where it is absolutely clear that it doesn't make sense to try to model what will happen in 60 or 70 years time, and there you're almost forced to think in terms of scenarios. So Shell was perhaps the first type of company doing it. It has also contributed a lot to the methodology of scenario thinking. Then a number of people who used to work with Shell have, for instance, moved to the OECD in Paris, and there it has also entered policy thinking, and I recall it's quite a number of years ago that also our own Central Planning Bureau did a study on scenario thinking, but really very long term. So it is applied, and it's more and more applied in the financial sector. But as I said earlier, I still think not enough. Also not in banking supervision, for instance. We still try to far more to think about to think that we know the risk and that we can use traditional risk management techniques.
No, we'll come to talk about that later, but I would imagine that in London there are some people working on Brexit scenarios as well as we speak. Like nobody knows what's going to happen, how hard it's going to hit, and I think your alert idea might be a very, very good one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it also happening in for instance, city planning. Yeah. Where people are coming together to share their ideas about how could a specific city or neighborhood or district develop. And it's especially interesting when you get the different stakeholders together, because then they start exchanging ideas about what this city could be. And by involving actually citizens in the whole process, a lot of ideas and a lot of possible futures emerge, and probably good things happening in that this scenario are translated to actions in which people work together instead of separate actions.
Yeah.
Rick makes an important point because the scenario is not, of course, an end in itself. It's a tool. As I said, it's for getting to a strategy in this the type of scenario that we are now discussing. But then, of course, when you have the strategy, you have to implement it, and you have to walk the strategy, and then you have to.
I'm actually going to come to that a little bit later on.
And also on Brexit, your point, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of scenario thinking going on in that area, and there you see another useful thing of thinking about in terms of scenarios. That is that you can try to design a strategy that is robust, that is not dependent on a specific outcome.
Yeah.
Given that Brexit and also earlier the Euro crisis are quite unique events, you cannot rely on the past to see what might happen. You need to use your imagination, as Timothy Geithner
to maneuver.
To maneuver and to deal with it. And it is. I think it's not perhaps not a surprise that scenario thinking is becoming more popular, because and that has to do with the increased interconnectedness, globalization, digitization of the world, which leads to increasing unpredictability, and so you need other tools there.
So with that, and we're getting questions, and whether we can speak about how you generate a scenario. Later on we will get to that. Once we've explained the three models, we will talk about how you actually construct scenarios that are useful not just for you as a consultant, but for the organization you work with. So we will come to that, Sophie. The second one, second type of scenario, is one that you're also very familiar with. You can give us a little bit of pointing in that direction, Lex, and it's around stress tests. It's all about reverse stress tests and regular stress tests. If you explain them shortly to us, then I'll move over to you.
So
it's daily bread for you.
Yeah, these are of course very popular and very frequent at the moment, and Yvonne will explain that in a minute. So the first set of scenarios is about the art of imagining the possible, and the second stress test and reverse stress test are about increasing your resilience. Again, in a complex and uncertain world, you cannot forecast. You are sure about only one thing, that you will be surprised. Surprises can be positive and negative. There definitely are potential negative surprises. And stress testing is all about coping with, protecting yourself against negative surprises. So what do you do in a stress test? You stress the system, and you try to imagine what would happen if a certain extreme but plausible event would happen, and then you imagine what would happen, and then you assess whether that is whether you feel sufficiently protected against such a scenario. If not, you could increase your buffers in your system, capital, liquidity are the most famous ones there. Reverse stress testing is helping you to think about what is extreme but still plausible. By reverse testing, and like the name says it, you reverse the process. In stress testing, you say, okay, this is an extreme but plausible event, and you then imagine, calculate if you have a quantity, what will happen, and should we do something to protect ourselves against it. In a reverse stress test, you use your imagination in another way. You say, what needs to happen for my company to go bankrupt, or for my bank to fall below capital levels that I don't find acceptable. Then again, you make such a scenario, and then you say, okay, if I look at this scenario, is this a scenario that I would like to live without protection, or do I want to be protected against it? For instance, one scenario could be that if an airplane falls on my company, I will go bankrupt. then the question is, okay, is this a scenario where you really want to hold capital against, for instance?
Yeah.
And in many cases, the answer will, of course, be no. But it's just one
But
example.
that's a silly example, but I can imagine that people at Uber now think about a scenario, well, what if all the major capitals in the world are going to vote us out?
Yeah.
With legislation.
And would that be the end of Uber?
Would it be the end of Uber, or do we do something else? I'm quite sure they are thinking about it, so it's very plausible.
And again, of course, what is plausible? There's then a judgment that you have to make with the people that are
at the
using
table.
at the table and are making the scenarios.
Yeah. But at least you're discussing it, which is new. So over to you, Yvonne in particular. I know you do a lot of stress tests. You work with a lot of financial institutions. What are typically the dials that you turn up to create a scenario?
Well, I think the most common way of thinking in stress scenarios, to stick to the point of stress scenarios, which is, I think, the most well-known way of scenario thinking, is apart from the regulatory side, because that's a whole story in itself. I think in the scenario thinking, the traditional way is to first come up with a qualitative scenario. As Lex also mentions, use your imagination to come up with scenarios that could potentially harm you.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I think most examples are also in the macroeconomic world, but particularly focusing also on second or even higher order effects. So, for example, what if the interest rates stay low for long? Then, of course, that has a direct effect, but it will change the behavior of all, citizens even. So we will start rethinking pension, for example, or buying a house or not. So it will change the complete macroeconomic system if that situation lasts for a longer term. And how will that affect the business model? So not only that we need to charge higher rates on the mortgage loans, for example, but maybe the whole volume of mortgage loans will change a lot. So I think that first start with the qualitative part of the scenarios, and then evaluate from a qualitative perspective what are the most relevant scenarios, and then start generating the more financial parameters to measure that scenario, and to be able to measure also the impact of that scenarios. And then in every step, I think select the scenarios that are most relevant, and then come up with a limited set of scenarios that everybody agrees is makes sense to evaluate, and then try to calculate to the extent possible what the impact will be.
Yeah.
And I think an important next step could be to complement, let's say, the quantitative scenarios with more fully qualitative scenarios based on storytelling, for instance. Because, let's say, individual experience, using your imagination, but also using the experience of people, for instance, who have experienced a crisis, and using their stories about that crisis to derive, let's say, the do's and don'ts in such a crisis, and helping that in building your scenario. So I think that's a next step to try to combine both quantitative and more qualitative elements.
And also nice is in the reverse stress testing is that I think there we see that the qualitative and quantitative angles can also complement each other in a different way, because in reverse stress testing people can imagine scenarios that will harm us, but then we always tend to think in a certain direction, and we also did some investigation on how we can use the qualitative approach to kind of feed the imagination by using purely quantitative scenario generator to spot areas of specific combinations of say economic parameters or other circumstances, and then spot areas that you would not directly think of as a vulnerable scenario. And then you see that based on the quantitative techniques, you're vulnerable to that scenario. And then think of, how, from a qualitative perspective, what's going on here? What causes this? And what are the dynamics in this scenario? So you can think of the situation where the quantitative approach stimulates the qualitative imagination.
Yeah, and I think it could also on top of that, what I also tend to find quite useful is using, let's say, replaying, as it were, stress scenarios of the past. So playing the Lehman Brothers crisis forward and see what would happen in the current environment if you replay it. You should use all kinds of ways of approaching it, quantitative, qualitative, mechanic.
Exactly, and a lot of that comes back to culture, because I was going to ask you one more thing, if I can be sort of the devil's advocate here. I think it's great, but when I read in the newspapers about stress tests and banks have passed the test or failed, you just read sort of the outcome and then, there's probably cake in the boardroom, we passed it again. I never feel a real sense of direction of change or desire of change. To which degree is it like, oh my gosh, you've got to do this, tick in the box? And to which degree do they truly and honestly investigate themselves and their own brain and open the windows to the world? I mean, you work with people in these situations. I think we're interested to hear your experiences.
Yeah, probably as you're starting by saying the art of imagination. So probably it's a challenge to involve a large group of people from an organization or a team or whatever institution to think together about the scenarios and to create a language together which will become part of the DNA of the organization or the company. Yeah. Instead of a small group actually ticking the box and we do our scenarios and that's it.
It's the power of vulnerability, huh? Yeah.
It is, but it's also, I think it is, we have to realize that we come from a world and still in a world where, let's say, being in control is found to be very important. So a lot of the governance tools and the planning and control techniques that we have assume that you are able to forecast and to predict. So I think it's fair to say that in the banking sector, where stress testing is now perhaps most widespread of all sectors that we know, it has been triggered by the regulators, and it's my impression, it's not owned like you suggested. It's not owned, let's say, by the board of the bank. So what they tend to do is to set up a unit with clever boys and girls who can generate the scenarios, and then they tick the box that they have complied with the regulatory requirement, and they do not fully own the importance of scenario thinking themselves. And I think that has to, to the benefit of the banks and other sectors, that has to change. So you have to find a way to get buy-in from the top. Yeah,
this is why we're doing these webinars. We need all of you to be the next generational managers who do this. The third scenario I want to briefly touch base with you on is the opportunities-based scenario, which I personally find very fascinating. If you look at investors in fintech, it's often more about not so much the bottom, but it's about like how high is my sky, how much explosive growth can any company take? Can you just point a little bit, the framework around that?
Yeah, so and let me again summarize what we have seen so far. So you have the possible world, so what determines your course of action, your strategy and your compass. Then you have the stress scenarios, which help you to cover your downside, avoid that you end up in the abyss or go bankrupt. And then you have the third type here is the stretch or sometimes called the heaven scenarios. Then you imagine, again, if in the extreme, but still plausible situation where everything goes the right way, where would I end up then? And that scenario can be used to try to push up your first scenario, so your strategy to the stress one. So what you try to do is to run your company in such a way that your possible scenario over time moves towards the stretch one, and you then define a new stretch one. So it creates an incentive for getting the best out of what you're doing and overachieving in the end.
Yeah, it won't come as a surprise to you that all of those that I've seen, it's never about the money, it's always about the talent. How and where do I create a culture to attract enough talent? But over to you, have you worked with those sort of scenarios, and what have been your experiences? Stretch scenarios.
Yeah, I think a beautiful experience is that it is fun, that people actually really love to think in the future and to think the unimaginable, the unimaginable. So and probably it's also important to challenge them a little bit and to show them different ways of making the scenarios. So it probably a well-known method is using Lego serious play, for instance. But you could also use all kinds of phenomena like artificial intelligence, or what's actually happening in the world right now, and in 5 years or 10 years and 15 years. So then people get these stories and these ideas about what could the world look like, and from there what will happen actually to our company or to our city. So that's probably my experience, is that it's fun, and probably the challenge is to it takes quite a time, you know. You can't do it in a day.
No.
But actually, you need people to make the stories, to tell the stories, to share ideas, and actually to translate them in much more practical courses of actions.
Yeah.
What I now all of a sudden recall that here in this scenario, more than any of the others, I think it's about creativity, creating a possible future, seeing a future that others don't see, but it's still possible. This is the area where art and creativity, art and culture, meet doing business and running a company and being an entrepreneur. And it reminded me of. Last year, it was last year that we were in Canada, Rick, with Janet Hanna, one of our practitioners at Locomnet, and she showed a project in which people indeed were doing scenario thinking by making paintings, putting their imagination in a painting, and it shows so much more than putting it in words. A picture shows more than 1,000 words.
It's very interesting. I've recently done one, and we asked all the people in the group to write a letter to themselves from the future. And so they had to place themselves fast forward in 10 years' time. And I said, write a letter to yourself, or if it's too difficult, because sometimes for people it's too creative, to whatever, a colleague who's left the company, your mother. And they said, okay, and so I can tell them what happened today, and then next year. I said, no, you've got to start 10 years and then look back, because otherwise you'll start building a roadmap again. And the beauty is, and then we analyzed the letters, and we looked at the certain words that came back. And that's how we found out that everybody was talking about the talent element. Everybody thought talent will be a challenge, much more than the money. And also, but we'll come back to this in another program, the storytelling, but you really see the narrative of putting it in normal words.
But what you see is that we have difficulties thinking in these opportunities and possibilities, because also in the world of scenarios and scenario thinking, it has typically been in the area of risk managers. Well, those are not people that like to think in opportunities, but they like to think in worst case scenarios. We've seen it in practice a lot also recently in, for example, credit risk modeling, where the new IFRS 9 accounting rules really require to evaluate your results under a set of scenarios, including both downside and upside risks. And that turns out to be difficult. Well, you could encounter that with the more creative approaches, but also, for example, a very effective tool is to use the downside scenarios and then turn them around. So, well, okay, if this can happen on the negative side, then there's also a positive counterpart to it, and then start thinking from that, turning around the scenario, and then, well, that comes up with well, interesting results.
Yeah, you're giving me the perfect bridge here, because we had a question from our audience, from Sophia, and it's a question that I have in my mind as well. We've now looked at a number of possible scenarios and how to typify them. Let's go to the basics. How do you build a scenario? Who builds it? Is it a consultant or an analyst, or does the team know it themselves? Do you have a certain model? Who's in charge? Because we can also imagine that people build scenarios because they want a particular outcome. So how do you keep a grip on the influences? So over to you two. Give us some. How do you build a scenario?
I think the answer here there's multiple ways. I've good experience by getting a lot of people involved. For instance, when you have a city, you probably start by asking the citizens to do that. And a good way, because technology is going fast, is that we have all kinds of collaboration platforms. So you could invite people on these platforms and actually asking them to send in their stories in a video or just typing. So that will create kind of a system, a social system in which people start to interact with each other, generate ideas. And then you have actually to create the conditions to go very structured through the process. So at a certain time, there is a step to crystallize all the ideas and bring these people in a room and actually start to ask them, okay, now we are going to make 2, 4, or 8 scenarios. Yeah. And let's do it.
Who is typically the person who gives you the order to do a scenario? I mean, I'm not talking now about the stress test, because we can imagine they have to do it. It'll be somebody in compliance. But is it typically somebody from inside the company, or is it a consultant? Do you always need a moderator? Does the moderator need to be in the company or preferably outside? Practical stuff.
Well, I think it's always good to have, well, a facilitator or an experienced person involved from outside, also to break the traditional way of thinking, because I think in every company or organization there is a certain way of thinking in possibilities and impossibilities. For example, in the financial industry, everybody is very much used to always associating a scenario with a likelihood. Yeah. Well, but in the scenario thinking, I think, well, it's most interesting when there is no likelihood. It's just a scenario without. And if you're not used to that, then you really need someone from outside to come back to that way of thinking. Every time you tend to move away from that objective.
So I do think that, let's say, ownership at the top is crucial for really being effective. In your
and involving all disciplines, all different stakeholders. Well, like I mentioned before, it's scenario thinking is traditionally in the risk or in the compliance area, but you really need to have all disciplines at the table and first agree on some qualitative scenarios before you do any kind of quantitative
I think
stuff.
it's also important for what Rick said. If you do not involve, let's say, many people, stakeholders, you miss a lot of information and knowledge. And that's exactly what is crucial in a complex system, not to do that. We know that in a complex system, it's almost, again, a definition that a lot of information is dispersed, and you can never have that available at the top. So you have to collect your information from many stakeholders and many areas, and build your scenario to the input from many people.
Yeah.
Yeah, what makes a good scenario is, I think, first start with involving a lot of stakeholders to come up with a broad set of qualitative, creative scenarios. But then also, if you want to make it more tangible and put a number to it, then of course there comes the art of the more making a consistent scenario and economically consistent.
Yeah.
And I
But you
think
will revisit it over time.
yes, of course. But I think that it's important to come back to the question: what makes a good scenario? Start with the qualitative, and then take it back to maybe the quantitative people and the economists, and then bring it back again. Or is this still the scenario that you think is the relevant scenario? So again, all stakeholders need to agree that this is the scenario that we will evaluate, because otherwise the
fight
results,
over the outcome. Yes.
And I think it's important that you link it to action. Why does this company, this department want to make a scenario? You want to use it, as we have emphasized several times now this afternoon. So what I also think maybe a next step, or perhaps it already happens, curious to hear, to not only use a scenario as a imagination of what the outside world will have for impact on you, but also think about what you could do to influence. So you have
So almost link it to your current management structure or your way of working
for
in
instance,
your company.
the example that you gave that in the scenarios that you discussed, that talent was how do you get talent was a crucial thing that came out of it. So then you could think about what could we do to get this talent, and introduce that in your scenario. And then you can end up with this opportunity scenario, or also the possible scenario.
And I also think that it's a misguided idea that you think, well, a board will do a scenario and they'll buy all into it on day one and they're going to love it. I think it's also something that has to grow on them. And once you get more sort of used to the idea of scenarios, you'll see ways to incorporate it more in your management culture almost, isn't it? Because it really, if you think about it, you have to be willing to challenge yourself, and to be a little bit more vulnerable. And it's not like, look at us doing the right thing here. It's a different culture, isn't it, Rick?
Yeah, I even think it has to go further than only management. So you could also say it's kind of a learning process, and learning people to make mind shifts, and not only the board, but also people actually doing the work or working with clients, to challenge them to think different. And so if this could be part of the culture, and you have this reiterating thinking and sessions, and so it shouldn't be in one department.
No.
And it just so I think the real challenge is to convince people that it's important to think forward and to see what's happening in the world.
It requires you to be bold as, let's say, the manager, the CEO, because you lose. You give up part of your control.
It's bold and humble at the same time, isn't it?
Bold and humble.
Yeah, and important.
That's not easy.
Important word that I wrote down also is actionable. The scenario should be actionable.
Yeah.
If that's not the case, then it's kind of a nice exercise. But if you cannot translate it to action or to changes to your everyday business, then I think it can be pretty useless.
And then here's another one from the cynic, because I've watched a few in action. Scenario thinking is also about being willing to see the signs, but also to read the signs. So how do we teach people in scenario thinking to actually see what they don't want to see? Because that's often the case. Everybody saw what was happening before the crisis, but it was musical chairs. We didn't want to see it. So how do we learn to see, and how do we learn to read the signs?
Now, first of all, what scenario thinking can be used for is to look for signs. That's the first thing that you should you should use the scenarios for putting your glasses on, as we discussed earlier. So you never know exactly what sign you will see. That's the point. But where you have to look is defined by, let's say, what you think are the most important drivers, and that may change over time. But at any time, your scenarios help you to look in certain areas. That's the first thing. That's perhaps the easiest thing. The second thing is indeed you need to have a culture, what is sometimes called a just culture, in which you, that's especially for the bad news scenarios, for the downside scenarios, where people are constantly looking for flaws and are constantly looking for bad news and are constantly stressing their own systems and see the weak points before they turn into incidents and before they put you in the abyss. That requires a just culture where people are not punished for finding weak spots, where they are rewarded for doing so if they come up with a solution. And this is easier said than done. I think it is relatively well done in the private sector. The public sector is very bad at it. It's very bad at it because a minister, the last thing that he or she wants is to hear that his policy doesn't work.
It always has ramifications.
So combining on the one hand being held accountable for what you do with being able to learn from mistakes and surprises, that's very difficult. And there, scenario thinking can help you if you combine it with a culture, the just culture, where the incentives are right.
An important lesson that I also learned in risk management is in looking for signals is the turning around the scenarios way of thinking. So if there is a business area or a department where a lot of money is made or no mistakes are reported, then there's probably something wrong. So if there are no mistakes reported or no issues at all, then that's an area you need to look in. That's a signal. That's a signal to turn the scenario around, or what is causing that you make a lot of money, for example, and what if that would be the other way around? So also good news is an important signal in scenario thinking.
I think
the famous Madoff example, it was too good to be true, so it probably was.
I think this is very crucial that you look at it this way, because in risk management you often have the red, amber, green of certain risks, and if you only look at red, you will at one day be surprised by something that has all the time been green, and all of a sudden turns out to be the black swan. So I very much agree with what Yvonne said about also looking sometimes at things where nothing is reported, or only good news is reported.
Very valid point, Konrik.
Probably going further about the signs, it's probably also really important to look outside. So what's actually happening in the world? So what kind of inventions are there, or what kind of trends, and what kind of... so there are a lot of think tanks, there are a lot of reports. And how can you actually offer people in a scenario exercise all this information? Because that will make them think different outside their organization and outside what they already know. So it's the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns.
At the same time, that has a certain risk, because then people think that you will offer them what the future will look like. And I have several examples of that they want to know from me in an area where they are the experts. They are running a municipality, they are running a company, where I'm not the expert. So I can tell you perhaps what the interest rate may do, but how relevant is that for a municipality? Perhaps sometimes for a municipality. But I think part of the scenario thinking is that the owners of the scenario are stimulated to think themselves, and imagine themselves. What are, from our expertise and related to our company, what are important developments? And all these broad macro trends are not so relevant
No.
for
And
small
actually,
companies.
I also think it really helps to bring in other disciplines. For instance, I saw this beautiful letter from Mr. Rinoy Khan. Let's bring in an ICT, subliminal, forward-looking guy into the government. And I thought, that's great. But then we get more science. We're really missing everything about the morals and the ethics around technology advancing. And I think if you bring other disciplines into a scenario planning, you also open up people's minds to different...
Exactly, and I think the idea from having a chief scientist in a government or an advisor, again, I think is also risky, because it creates the impression that that guy or girl knows...
We'll take care of it.
We'll take care of it. That's the point.
Exactly.
And you cannot hide. In the end,
No.
you are responsible for your decisions, and they are based on your imagination.
Yeah. As we're approaching the clock, I want to table one more topic, because here we're all sitting cozy in our Western European environments and our observations. It's very important we look further and we look internationally. How does scenario thinking work in different cultures? Because we have a culture, for the Dutch it's natural to be rebellious, so we will happily think probably in other dimensions. For the Americans it's natural to be optimistic. But how does it work, and does scenario thinking find its feet in any possible culture? What about Eastern cultures? Rick, I know you've been looking into this.
Yeah, we talked about that, and I actually remembered a book which is already 5,000 years old. It's actually the I Ching, Chinese book, in which they, in short, actually say there is kind of 64 different opportunities or scenarios for each situation, for each person, for life. So I think that's very interesting, because it's
You
probably...
should have shown it before. That would have spared us the whole...
So we can
what are the two
trace...
axes they built them on?
Yeah, it's the yin and the yang axis. But probably the interesting thing, if you are talking about cultures, is that I'm very curious to hear that from Chinese listeners. That probably this should be already in deep in the culture, deep in the way of thinking of Eastern cultures or Chinese culture. And probably what you see is for instance, Singapore as a city, as a state, is doing a lot with scenario planning.
Yeah, they're very advanced.
I would say, let's say the fact that the future is uncertain is a part of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
That's everywhere the case. And if you look historically, we talked about narratives, literature, and stories are very old, and our ways of dealing with the future are basically rudimentary scenario thinking. So I think it's useful everywhere. It has been practiced. I think everywhere. Still, I do think that it is difficult. More difficult in some cultures than in others. We discussed earlier that if you want to involve, let's say, everybody in it, it means that you ignore hierarchy and try to be bold and humble, and that's not as simple in culture A as in culture B. So if you want to run scenarios where you want to use all that information, you have to think about how to protect.
Yeah, and work probably very closely with local partners. Yeah.
For instance, in narratives, but we will talk about it in a future
in a separate program.
Series. Yes, it's very important that you collect the stories by people who trust.
Who are trusted.
The one who is.
Yeah.
And depending on the culture, in one culture you could focus more on the upside scenarios, and in the other culture maybe focus more on the downside scenario. And of course we know that the world is not symmetric, but still it can provide a lot of insights.
Yeah, I think so too.
And people respond to it differently.
And people respond to it. No, and people respond to it. That makes it interesting.
One example that I had at my time when I was at Robeco. 1 minute. At Robeco, then I gave, to show that the different people in different cultures may respond very differently to the same scenario. So I gave presentations, scenarios for the world economy next year. Do that in the US, Germany, the Netherlands. In the US, always very lively discussions. People that came to you say, "How can I benefit from this?"
Yeah.
Then you went to Germany, and then not very lively. At the end of the presentation, several people came to you and said, "I'm happy that I've solved everything." Then in the Netherlands, it's something in between. So it's cultural. There is a cultural element.
There is a culture thing. Thank God, we can still love and learn from each other.
Exactly.
As we're starting to round off, I always look for quotes from older and wiser people than myself. And I was actually looking at a man I very much admire who was a star in complexity and uncertainty, because he was highly complex and uncertain himself and very robust, Winston Churchill. Yeah. He knew a thing or two about that. It's actually quite interesting. He was much better in stress than in normal life. And he said, "It is always nice to look ahead, but it's very hard to look further than one can see." So as I was reading that, I was thinking, with scenarios, how far out can you take a scenario and still sort of let it be realistic? Do you have any thoughts, close thoughts, 1 minute each on this?
Yeah, well, I think scenarios are a tool, not an objective in itself, of course, and a tool to adjust the business strategy. And I think it should, the scenarios horizon should align with that planning cycle, so to say. And I think most companies make plans for, say, 3 years in advance. So I think that would be a good, rule of thumb to stick to that horizon.
Okay, good.
Yeah, to go on the tooling. So I think scenario thinking is a tool, and actually it's helping people to learn to use their imagination. So mostly at the end of a workshop I say, okay, now you have 4 scenarios, and actually you know already that none of the scenarios is coming true. Yeah. And then something happens with people.
I agree very much with what Yvonne said on the horizon. You should
keep it
to your planning cycle, and the planning cycles also not by accident are most of the time 3-4 years. On the other hand, there are industries where you have to make investments for 60, 70 years. So there I think you have to stretch your imagination, but not to make it very precise, but to put something on the longer term horizon, but be precise as you can, only for 3 to 4 years. And I think it's interesting, because what does this mean, not to be discussed today probably anymore, but what does this mean, for instance, for climate change scenarios? Yeah. Stretching tens of years. Yeah. And how useful is that?
And with that thought, we're going to conclude the program about scenario thinking. Thank you for your active contributions and responses, and of course, thanks to our faculty. Thank you, Lex. Thank you, Rick Berbé. Thank you, Yvonne. I hope you all enjoyed it a little bit as well. Note in your agendas, the next live GlowCommNet panel discussion will take place on January 25 on personal development. So we'll see you back in 2018. I'm Connie Dorrestein. Goodbye.